I was the one who paid for his first suit. Not metaphorically, literally. The navy blue one he wore to his first real job interview at a commercial real estate firm in downtown Chicago. We were 26. I had just gotten a small bonus from my accounting job, and he told me he had nothing appropriate to wear. I said, "Let's go get you something." We went to Nordstrom on Michigan Avenue, and I put $340 on my credit card without blinking. He got the job. He wore that suit for 3 years. I think about that suit a lot now. My name is Elise. And by the time this story ends, I was 31 years old, sitting across from a man I had never met before, listening to him tell me something that changed everything about my husband, about the woman my husband had chosen over me, and about how much my silence had actually been worth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My husband's name is Grant. We met at 24 through mutual friends at a birthday party in Wicker Park. He was charming in that quiet, deliberate way. Not the loudest person in the room, but the kind of man who made you feel like you were the only person he was paying attention to. We dated for 2 years, got engaged, and married in a small ceremony in Wisconsin where my parents live. Nothing flashy, just the people we loved, a tent in a backyard, fairy lights, and good food. For the first 4 years of our marriage, things were fine. Not perfect, but genuinely fine. We both worked hard. We split the bills evenly. He got promoted. I switched firms and took a pay cut to have better hours. We talked about buying a house. We argued about stupid things, whose turn it was to call the plumber, whether we were saving enough, whether his mother visited too often. Normal stuff. Then he got promoted again, senior associate director at the firm. His salary jumped by almost $60,000 in 1 year. And something shifted. I didn't see it right away. I told myself he was just stressed. More responsibility, longer hours, more to prove. I told myself the distance I felt was temporary. I told myself a lot of things. The first sign was cologne. Grant had worn the same cologne since I'd known him, the cedar and citrus thing he'd gotten as a gift and just kept buying. One Monday evening, he came home and he smelled different. Something darker, more expensive. I asked him if he'd changed his cologne. He said a client had given him a sample at a work lunch. I let it go. 2 weeks later, I noticed he'd started working out again. Not the casual twice-a-week gym visits he'd always done. This was different. 5 days a week before work without me ever suggesting it. He bought new running shoes. He started turning down dessert. I told a friend of mine, Grant is really taking care of himself lately, and she raised her eyebrows just slightly. I chose not to notice. By January, he was coming home late at least 3 nights a week. He always had an explanation. Giant dinner. End of quarter push. Drinks with the team. The explanations were always plausible. They were also always slightly vague. I'd ask who was there, and he'd name 1 or 2 people and then change the subject. Then came the phone. Grant had never been secretive with his phone before. It sat on the kitchen counter. He'd handed to me to Google something while he was driving. It was just a phone. But sometime around February, it became a thing he carried everywhere and placed face down on every surface. I noticed. I didn't say anything the first time. Or the second. The third time I said, "You keep flipping your phone over." He said, "Do I? I don't even notice. Habit. I picked up at work, people are weird about screens and meetings." I looked at him. He looked back at me. And I thought, either I believe him or I don't. I believed him. Or I wanted to. The moment I stopped being able to pretend was a Tuesday in March. I got home from work early because a client had rescheduled. I wasn't trying to catch him in anything. I was just tired and grateful for an extra hour. I walked into our apartment, set down my bag, and heard him on the phone in the bedroom. The door was half open. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was just walking to the kitchen. But I heard his voice. He was speaking in a tone I hadn't heard him use with me in over a year. Soft. Warm. A little amused. He said, "You're ridiculous, you know that?" And then laughed, this low, easy laugh, and then said her name. Vanessa. He said it like it was something delicate, like it was a word he liked saying. I stood in the hallway and I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. Then I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the counter and tried to decide what I knew. When he came out, he seemed startled to see me. He said, "Oh, you're home early." I said, "Client rescheduled." He said, "That's nice. How was your day?" And I said, "Fine." And I set down my glass and I went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and stared at the tile until I felt something click into place inside me. Not breaking. Clicking. Like something that had been wobbling finally just settled. I knew. I didn't say anything that night. I made dinner. We watched television. He fell asleep on the couch, and I sat there watching him sleep, and I thought, I am going to handle this correctly. I am not going to scream. I am not going to cry in front of him. I am going to find out what I'm actually dealing with before I say a single word. It took me 6 weeks. I was careful. I'm an accountant. I know how to look at numbers and find what doesn't fit. I started with our joint account. Nothing unusual there. Then I remembered he had a personal checking account that we'd always kept separate just for ease since before we married. I had never monitored it because it was his. But I knew the login. He'd given it to me years ago when I had to deposit something while he was traveling. The statements were not subtle. Restaurants I'd never been to. A hotel in the West Loop charged on a Wednesday night when he'd told me he was at a work dinner. A jewelry store, not the kind that sells professional gifts. A weekend charge at a resort in Michigan. I printed everything and put it in a folder. Then I hired a private investigator. I'd never imagined doing something like that in my life. It felt like something from a movie. But my friend, the one who had raised her eyebrows, knew someone who knew someone, and she connected me to a woman who was professional and discreet and asked very few unnecessary questions. Within 3 weeks, I had photographs, restaurants, a parking garage, the lobby of an apartment building in River North, and a name. Vanessa Holt. I looked her up. She was 34. She worked at a competing firm. Not the same company as Grant, but the same industry. She had a LinkedIn profile that showed someone polished and successful. She had a husband. His name was Marshall. I don't know why that detail hit me as hard as it did. I think I had assumed, on some level, that she was single, that she was someone who had nothing to lose. But she had a husband, which meant there were two of us. I sat with that for a week, and then I made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I didn't file for divorce immediately. I know that sounds strange, but I needed more information first. I needed to understand the finances, specifically whether Grant was hiding money or planning to move assets. After what I'd seen in his account, I didn't trust him to be straightforward about anything. I hired a forensic accountant, a woman recommended by my divorce attorney, and told her I needed to know if there was anything I was missing. I had a consultation with my attorney in early April. Her name was Catherine Reyes, and she was exactly the kind of person you want in your corner. Unhurried, precise, and completely unsentimental. She laid out my options calmly. She told me that Illinois is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets get divided fairly but not necessarily equally. She told me the condo was in both our names. She told me that my decision about timing could matter. I didn't tell Grant any of this. I came home from that appointment and made pasta and asked him about his day. What came next, I did not plan. It was a Thursday evening in late April. I was working late at my own office, genuinely working. A tax deadline for a corporate client. My phone rang at 7:45. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. The man on the other end introduced himself as Marshall Holt. He said he knew who I was. He said he needed to talk to me. I sat very still. He said he had found out about the affair 3 weeks ago. He said he had been doing his own investigation and his own lawyer had flagged something unusual. Significant funds were being transferred from his and Vanessa's joint investment account to a separate account he hadn't known about. He said he had reason to believe that Grant was not only having an affair with his wife, but had been financially involved with her in ways that were more complicated than either of us had realized. He said, I think they were planning to leave together. I think they've been planning it for a while. I asked him how he'd found my number. He said, the same way you probably found mine if you've been paying attention. I had. We agreed to meet in person. I told my attorney before I did anything else. Catherine advised me to be careful, to listen more than I spoke, and to share nothing I wasn't comfortable with. She said she'd like to be updated afterward. I said I would. Marshall and I met at a coffee shop in Evanston, far enough from downtown that neither of us was likely to run into anyone we knew. He was not what I expected. He was calm, methodical. He wore a fleece vest and looked like someone's dad, which I mean as a compliment. There was something grounding about his steadiness. He was 41. He'd been married to Vanessa for 9 years. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank transfer records, emails between Grant and Vanessa that Marshall's attorney had subpoenaed, and a document showing that Grant had quietly taken out a home equity line of credit on our condo without my signature, which was, Catherine would later confirm, fraudulent, and had funneled $68,000 into an account I'd never seen. I read through the documents once without speaking. Then I read them again. I said, "How long?" He said, "The financial activity starts about 14 months ago. The account was opened in Vanessa's name with Grant as a secondary holder. My attorney thinks they were building a fund to leave on." 14 months. I thought about 14 months ago. I thought about the cologne. I thought about the gym visits. I thought about the suit I bought him when we were 26. I asked Marshall what he wanted to do. He said he wanted his money back, his half of the joint assets that Vanessa had moved without his consent. He said he was prepared to file immediately, but that his attorney had advised him that if we filed simultaneously and shared documentation, it would be harder for either Grant or Vanessa to claim the other was lying. He said he wasn't asking me to do anything I wasn't already planning to do. He was just asking if I was willing to coordinate. I asked him why he was telling me all this. I asked him why he'd reached out instead of just handling his own case. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Because she's done it before. Before me. She had a relationship with a married man when she was in her mid-20s, and the wife had no idea what was actually happening financially until after the divorce was final. I don't want that to happen to you." I drove home that night and parked in the garage and sat in the car for 20 minutes. Then I called Catherine. The next 2 weeks were the most precisely organized weeks of my life. Catherine filed a motion to freeze marital assets. The fraudulent HELOC became a central piece of our case. My signature had been forged, which elevated the situation from messy divorce to potential criminal fraud. Marshall's attorney and Catherine coordinated their timelines. When Grant was served papers on a Wednesday morning in mid-May, Vanessa was served the same afternoon. I was not home when it happened. I had arranged to stay with my parents in Wisconsin for the week. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to see his face when he realized how much I knew. He called me 11 times that day. I answered on the 12th. He started with shock, moved quickly to anger, and then, when neither of those got a reaction, landed on remorse. He said he had made a terrible mistake. He said it had meant nothing. He said he loved me and he didn't want to lose our life together. I waited until he finished. Then I said, "You forged my signature on a home equity loan, Grant." Silence. I said, "That's not a mistake. That's a choice you made 14 months ago and kept making every day since." He said, "Elise," I said, "my attorney will be in touch." And I hung up. I did not cry. I had cried already, for weeks, quietly, in the shower, in my car, in the break room at work when I thought no one would come in. I had cried for the marriage. I thought I had. And for the version of myself that had stood in a Nordstrom and handed over $340 because I believed in someone. I had cried for the wasted patience and the explanations I'd accepted and the signs I'd let slide. I was done crying. What followed was 6 months of legal process. Grant retained an attorney, but between the forged HELOC, the documented financial misconduct, and the records Marshall's attorney had provided, his leverage was limited. He could fight, and he did, but the evidence was too organized. The condo settlement went in my favor. I received my equitable share of marital assets plus damages tied to the fraudulent credit line. The criminal fraud question was eventually resolved through a civil settlement negotiated between our attorneys. Grant repaid every dollar of the unauthorized HELOC plus interest and legal fees in writing as a condition of Catherine not escalating to the state's attorney's office. Vanessa's situation with Marshall was its own separate case, and I only know what Marshall told me, which was that it resolved but not easily. The last time I saw Grant in person was at the final hearing. We were in the same courthouse hallway for maybe 4 minutes. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. He looked, honestly, a little diminished, like someone who had been very certain about himself for a long time and had recently run out of runway. He didn't speak to me. I didn't speak to him. I walked out of that courthouse in October, and the air was cold. That sharp early fall Chicago cold that feels like a reset, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and took a breath. My phone buzzed. A text from Marshall. How'd it go? I wrote back, done. You? He replied, same. Take care of yourself, Elise. I put my phone in my pocket and started walking to the parking garage. There's a version of this story where I end by telling you I'm thriving, that I redecorated the apartment and started dating again and found myself. Maybe I will, eventually. It's only been a few months. Right now I'm still in the in-between, still recalibrating what I trust. Still sometimes waking up at 3 in the morning and lying there thinking through the timeline. Still occasionally angry, not in a hot way, but in that low, steady way that I think might be useful if I let it be. But here's what I know right now. I know that I handled it. I didn't fall apart. I didn't do anything I'm ashamed of. I built a case the right way. I asked for help when I needed it, and when it counted, I was ready. I know that the woman I was at 26, the one who put a suit on a credit card because she believed in someone, she wasn't a fool. She was just generous with the wrong person. And that's not a character flaw. That's just bad luck. I know that Marshall Holt, a man I had never met before April of this year, sat across from me in a coffee shop in Evanston and told me something he didn't have to tell me. And I am quietly, genuinely grateful for that. And I know this. The next suit I buy, I'm buying it for myself. I've been thinking a lot lately about the difference between being naive and being trusting. Because for a long time after all of this, I kept calling myself naive, like it was a flaw I needed to fix. Like the woman who bought that suit, who made dinner without asking questions, who accepted the explanations, like she was someone I needed to be ashamed of. But I don't think that anymore. Being trusting isn't a weakness. It becomes a problem only when you keep choosing it after the evidence is already in front of you. And the honest truth is, I did let things go longer than I should have, not because I was stupid, because I was afraid of what knowing would cost me. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to see it clearly. What Grant did wasn't a single mistake that spiraled. It was a sequence of deliberate choices. The account, the transfers, the forged signature, made over 14 months while he came home and ate dinner across from me and slept in our bed. Each one of those choices required him to look at me and decide I didn't matter enough to tell the truth to. That's not a moment of weakness. That's a pattern of character. And a person's character, when it finally shows itself fully, tends to look exactly like every smaller thing they did before, just louder. Vanessa made the same kind of choices. And what happened to both of them wasn't some outside force coming to punish them. It was simply the natural result of building something on a foundation of lies. Lies require maintenance. They require more lies, more cover, more coordination. Eventually, the structure gets too heavy. It collapses under its own weight. That's not fate. That's just math. What I keep coming back to is Marshall, a man I had never spoken to before April, who had every reason to stay in his own lane and handle his own case quietly. He didn't have to call me. He didn't have to share what he knew. But he did it anyway because he'd watched someone else get blindsided before. And he didn't want to be the kind of person who let it happen again when he had the power to prevent it. That's not heroism. It's just decency. But I want to remember what it felt like to be on the receiving end of it. Because I think decency is something you have to practice deliberately, and I want to practice it. The thing about going through something like this, the investigation, the attorneys, the courthouse hallways is that it forces a kind of clarity you can't manufacture any other way. I know now what I'm capable of when I stop waiting for someone else to fix things. I know I can read a financial statement and find what doesn't belong. I know I can sit across from a stranger and listen carefully and make a good decision. I know I can be scared and still move forward anyway. I am 31 years old and I am starting over, and that is not a tragedy. It is just the next thing. The next suit I buy, I am buying it for myself.